is our first keynote of this year's symposium, and this session is Unburying My Father. Tonight's session will run from the top of the hour to 50 minutes after the hour. Never forget is a value that HFL holds dear. Our history, its celebrations, its triumphs, and struggles and grief have all molded the community. This session is an insight into the experience some of our blood brothers and sisters and those who love them have faced with hepatitis and the AIDS epidemic. HFL values the importance of understanding and honoring our history and hopes you will find this session helpful as we continue our promise to never forget. As such, we are honored to have Zander Masser join us as our speaker. But before we begin, a few housekeeping things. Just a reminder that all attendees will be on mute throughout, and we are hoping to allow time at the end for Q&A. But if you think of questions throughout the session, please put them in the Q&A box. And if you have difficulties during the session, feel free to reach out to one of our HFA staff members through the chat, or you could go to #helpdesk in the Slack environment. And without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Zander Masser, and we look forward to hearing your story, Zander. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks for having me. On a fall day in 1996, my parents called a family meeting. I was 11 years old. My brother was 14. We were in the living room. I sat on a green pleather couch next to my brother and across from my parents, my mom on the left and my dad on the right. There was an air of seriousness in the room, which was uncharacteristic for our household, so I knew something was wrong. I thought they were going to tell us that they were getting a divorce. I couldn't imagine anything worse than that. My mom did most of the talking. They told us that my dad had been HIV positive for over 10 years, my entire life, and that he had AIDS. They told us he had become infected with HIV through his hemophilia medication. They assured us that my mom, my brother, and me were not infected. They also explained the terminal nature of the disease, but tried to sound hopeful about my dad's various treatments and medications. And they talked about the amazing care he was receiving from his team at the Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. After that discussion, I knew that he was going to die, but I assumed it would be very far in the future, that my dad would be an old man by then. I lived in denial, even as my dad's health declined over the following 3 years. After that family discussion, the topic of my dad's death was not discussed again until the day he died. My grief started on the day of this family meeting. My dad died at the start of my adolescence, and while I was a typical teenager in terms of school and social life, my home life crumbled. My brother went off to college, leaving just my mom and me in the house. And inside my home, I was depressed. I moped around, slept a lot, and I directed all of my anger towards my mom. Eventually, I moved out to go to college. As I entered my 20s, my anger transformed into a quiet acceptance in which I spoke to almost no one about what I had been through. My internal dialogue remained very loud as I churned my brain, asking myself, who am I? Why am I the way that I am? The answer that continuously came to me was, I am who I am because my dad died. I am a grieving person, and my grief informs all that I am. I was always good at hiding my sadness, but in my mind, my dad's death had come to define me. Finally, in my 30s, a different way of moving through my loss emerged as I embarked on the creative and healing journey that I'm currently on. Every one of the thousands of lives lost to the tainted blood tragedy is unmeasurably significant and tragic. And every impacted family has their own story to tell. Today, I'm here to share one family's story. I'm going to take you on my journey of self-exploration and healing, which has taken the form of the book that I am now working to complete. As we move along together, you will see my dad's photos and hear stories about his life. You will see and hear pages from my book. I invite you to meet my dad, who was and will always be a member of the hemophilia community. My dad, Randy, lived with severe hemophilia B. He was a professional photographer. I grew up surrounded by his photos on the walls of our home. And when I conjure images of him in my mind, which I do many times a day, it's hard to imagine him without a camera around his neck. A decade after my dad died, my brother and I went into the basement of our childhood home, where my dad spent much of his time in his home studio and darkroom. We were looking for an opportunity to reconnect with him. We discovered thousands of photos, prints, slides, sheets of negatives, and old cameras and photography gear. We were overwhelmed with the amount that he had left behind. And we started just by holding sheets of slides up to the light to view the photos. Just looking at them in this way, we were enchanted by the imagery, and we wanted to share his photos with the world. So we got a few hundred slides scanned professionally. We talked periodically, but very little materialized. I don't think I was emotionally ready to start this kind of project at the time, and the photos remain largely untouched. Fast forward another few years, our childhood home was sold, and the photo collection moved to different locations a number of times. My dad's legacy, disorganized in a few boxes, was shuffled around houses in New York. I was eventually gifted an old slide scanner from a cousin, which prompted me to collect all of the slides and take them home with me. I began scanning and organizing the entire collection. I found myself committed to this process in a relentless way. I scanned 10,000 slides. I created an organized digital and physical archive of my dad's entire life's work. This was when the question that would bloom into my project came to me. How does one share the work of an artist that nobody knows? The answer to me was to share that artist's life story. Sadly, I realized I didn't really know my dad's story. I was only a kid when he died. I never had the chance to speak to him from an adult perspective, and after he passed, there wasn't a lot of talk about his life because the focus was much more on how to cope with his death. And so I compiled a list of every person I could think of that knew my dad, which included family, friends, colleagues, and healthcare professionals. I asked them to share their memories of my dad with me. I asked for stories, not descriptions, and I shared writing prompts to get their memories flowing. Some examples included the first time you met, a time you belly laughed with him, the moment you found out he was HIV positive, the moment you found out that he died, your experience at his funeral. The response was astounding, and I found myself transported into my dad's life as the stories flooded my inbox. I felt like he was in the room with me as I cried or laughed, often at the same time, through each anecdote. I read the stories many times, and when I went through all 10,000 slides, which I did several times, certain photos would trigger my memory of a specific story. I started to see a connection between my dad's lived experience and the images that he captured with his camera. I started to match the stories to the photos, And this made me feel like I was actually collaborating with my dad.
I remember that Aunt Elle was going to take us to the Statue of Liberty, and we were playing outside an apartment, and Dad jumped up on the bench and fell over and banged his knee, and it blew up like a balloon. And that was the first time I actually realized that he was sick.
As the stories rolled in, I became enamored with my dad's personality. I was never old enough to be his friend while he was alive, so the stories allowed me to feel a new type of closeness to him. They also confirmed my memory of him being a very funny person and very, very loved.
Randy made friends with people the way a lake reflects the sky. It can't help it.
Randy was on campus, and I got to spend a lot of time with him. He was a big personality in a small frame, and his friends called him the little king. He was the glue in the group. He brought a lot to the table. He'd be most likely to have the latest scoop on each of us. He kept track of everyone.
We had to drive up to Boston. We hit some traffic, and here we were, in traffic. He rolls down his window, and he's talking to the guy driving the car right next to us up in traffic. I remember him going, here, and he gave the guy an apple, just out of nowhere. That's who he was. He would just connect.
In the summer of '74, we began renting houses in Fire Isle in New York. Randy, Stewie and I, Tony and Maria, Mike and Iris Witt, and then Randy's cousin David joined us. The people across from us liked to fish and occasionally gave us some. One day, Randy took special care preparing a piece for himself. He left it in the kitchen and announced he was going to take a nap before dinner. He was sound asleep and showed no signs of getting up before morning. So the rest of us ate, and we just couldn't resist. We ate his fish. Hours later, after we had eaten, cleaned up, and were hanging out, Randy woke up. He arrived in the kitchen saying he couldn't wait to eat his fish. No one had the heart to tell him. Instead, we told him his fish was in the drawer. We laughed as he went from drawer to drawer. He couldn't believe that we could have actually eaten it. He was pretty pissed. From then on, whenever anyone misplaced something, we all had the answer. It must be in the drawer with Randy's fish.
A few of us were in our truck. We had been to a barbecue at the highway barn. Suddenly, we were off-road, driving through the woods, and the song Layla came on the radio. Bryce stopped the truck, and we all got out and started air guitaring and dancing, some on the hood and roof of the truck. Long song over, we got back in and were on our way. Only a couple of years before he died, the phone rang. It was Randy. He was driving along FDR Drive, and Layla came on the radio. He just had to call.
I also felt a deep sadness for my dad as I learned more about the lifelong assault of illnesses on his body. His life began with trauma. His parents lived in constant fear for his health and safety. And like so many other children with hemophilia during the 1950s, he spent much of his childhood in the hospital. He wore braces on his legs, and he was prohibited from playing sports and other physical activities.
Your father was in casts, and I had to bring him, to the hospital. He was in the hospital all the time, and I used to drive in every day, and he would say to me, "Mom, you don't have to come every day," when he was older. And I said, "I do have to come every day. First of all, not only to see my son, there were children there whose parents never came to see them. And that used to hurt me."
We were in the Pathmark supermarket near CW Post. Randy and I were talking. He told me he did not expect to live to be 30 and knew he would never be married or have children.
You know, he got one of his attacks, you know, and he couldn't walk or anything. So we went down the elevator, you know, our apartment, and then I literally carried him to the car, put him in the car, and literally carried him into the hospital.
He had a really hard time taking his meds. There were just too many fucking pills.
I felt proud of my dad as I learned that despite his hemophilia and subsequent physical disability and frequent blood transfusions at the hospital, he had friends, went to college, lived independently, and was a self-employed artist. I was peripherally aware that my dad was a part of a hemophilia association, but I did not know what his involvement was. For my project, I spoke to a former executive director of the Hemophilia Association of New York. He informed me that my dad was a board member for 20 years and even served as the vice president for a period of time. He advocated for policies to protect and benefit individuals with hemophilia. He led support groups for young adults with bleeding disorders, and he was often asked to counsel individuals and their families.
Well, he showed up for all of these board meetings, and we'd have him every couple of months. And that one time he was there, and he was all kind of bundled up and huddled. You know, he had this coat, and I remember the hat on and kind of a scarf wrapped around him, and you couldn't see who he was. But when it came time to say something, I mean, he said something. If I felt that sick, I probably wouldn't have come. But he did. You know, and that kind of makes me feel small.
As I learned more about my dad's activism, I came to really understand and internalize the story of the tainted blood tragedy. For those listening who are not familiar, in the early 1980s, blood products used to treat hemophilia and other bleeding disorders were infected with HIV. Over 10,000 people with hemophilia in the United States alone contracted the deadly virus. I gained a broader view of the hemophilia population and realized that my dad was not at all unique in his illness nor his HIV infection. When my parents told my brother and me about my dad's HIV status, they explained to us how he physically contracted the virus, but they did not go into detail about the greed and negligence of for-profit companies, government agencies, and nonprofit organizations that led to his infection. Without the full context, the Ricky Ray Hemophilia Relief Fund Act, which granted families $100,000 per individual, held very little meaning for me. And after my dad died, we never discussed the injustices surrounding his death. Only recently have I come to realize that my dad was, in fact, killed. Now that I've read, talked, and written about what happened, I'm able to channel some of my anger more appropriately. In June of 2021, my daughter was born in a hospital in Montreal. I froze for a moment when I noticed that the IV drip bag that helped my wife bring our daughter into the world featured the logo of a company that participated in my dad's death. In this moment, I realized that I will forever be tied to the tainted blood tragedy. It will never go away. During the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm triggered every time I hear the term tested positive, as I consider the striking parallels between COVID and the AIDS crisis. In my hometown, my dad took family portraits for so many families, and I would often see those distinct pictures taken in our basement on the walls and shelves of other people's homes. His photos hung on the walls of our local library, in our town hall, and even in the dentist's office. I remember seeing the local car mechanic in our basement with his family being photographed. On each Little League opening day ceremony, my dad would be high up in a crane above the crowds, photographing all of the action. Reviving my dad's photo collection helped me gain a deep appreciation and respect for his artistic talent and prolific collection. Many people mentioned to me that no one, including my grandparents, knew where my dad's interest in photography came from. My dad participated in life as much as he could, but because of his physical limitations associated with his hemophilia, he couldn't always engage the way others could. So he participated in his own way. As a kid, he would bat in baseball and another child would run for him. As a young adult, he helped manage his school sports teams instead of playing. As a dad, he was the town's Little League equipment manager. Akin to having a heightened sense of hearing if you are blind, I think that his observation skills were sharpened by being on the sidelines and watching others move through the world in a way that he couldn't. This translates to the camera lens. Once he picked up a camera, he was naturally skilled at identifying and capturing elements of everyday life in a meaningful and artful way. It became his life's passion and his career. I'd like to show you a few of my favorite photos, all of which were taken with film and developed by hand. As I pieced together my dad's life through stories, I reached the gaps that could only be filled by one person, my mom. My mother shared incredibly vulnerable stories about the challenges of being my dad's partner and caregiver. She also told me that she waited 10 years to get tested for HIV. Despite living in constant fear, she just couldn't bear the prospect that my dad could have transmitted HIV to her and their children. She only decided to get tested so that they could confidently disclose my dad's HIV status.
I was taking a course in social work school called The Emotional Impact of Chronic Illness. As part of the course, we met with patients in healthcare settings who would talk to us about their illnesses. There was a hemophilia clinic at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, and on that day, we learned about hemophilia and how chronic episodes of bleeding lead to arthritis, swollen and stiff joints, and limited range of motion. Marvin Gilbert, your dad's orthopedist, showed us your dad's knees. I immediately fell in love with his knees. I was asked by a colleague recently who does not know Randy to describe what he looks like. I was surprised that this innocent question surfaced a lot of emotion for me that I normally keep private about his physical state. Randy right now needs to be preoccupied with maintaining whatever health he does have, making him emotionally unavailable and physically diminished. He is weaker and he is in visible pain. He's unable to do many things like walking, driving, lifting, carrying, reaching without great difficulty. He is physically diminished because his body and muscles are wasting away. I have a huge responsibility to keep this ship afloat. My sleep is disturbed every night by Randy's cough, his chest congestion, and discomfort. I've come to look at these sounds as sounds of life, even though they are so disturbing. There isn't a night that doesn't go by where I'm asking him if he needs something or if there's something I can do for him. One night last week, he was so cold, extremely cold in reaction to a new medication, and no amount of blankets helped. I went as far as asking him if he wanted me to lie on top of him to keep him warm. The reality is that I probably would have crushed him.
That was an excerpt from a personal essay my mom wrote in the late 90s.
The 4 days I spent waiting to get my HIV test results were by far the darkest time in my life. It was filled with indescribable despair And I was confronted with my own mortality and Randy's as well. Randy and I would talk about his illness, but we did not talk about him dying. The last 2 years of his life were difficult for him in terms of feeling hopeful because he kept getting more and more infections. My job was to keep him motivated and positive. The last year of his life was probably the most difficult. He was so weak that it made him short of breath almost all the time. He cried when his hair fell out as a side effect of medication. Symbolically, it was a culmination of a lot of losses he had to face, including the prospect of losing his family and not being there for his boys.
In the years after his death, our intense grief, combined with my teenage angst and poor coping skills, made for a tense relationship between my mom and me. I directed my anger towards her, and she projected her anxiety onto me. Through this project, my mom and I have, for the first time ever, talked about our relationship openly and honestly. I've heard stories about her life with my dad that I had never heard before. I now have a clearer understanding of her experience and the incredible sacrifices and difficult choices she made. My mom loves me with her whole heart and without conditions. And that has never wavered, even in our most combative moments. My grandmother felt immense guilt around passing this genetic disorder on to my father. She became a fierce advocate and constant caregiver during his childhood. Later, my mother took over these roles. The challenges both of them faced were far more serious and devastating than they could have imagined. I need to acknowledge the critical role of the parents and partners of hemophilia. You give your all to your children, to your partners. You go above and beyond to organize and advocate, and you never, ever let your loved ones suffer more than they have to. Finally, the time came for me to document my own stories. I put on paper experiences that I had never shared with anyone. This was immediately cathartic. And as I placed my stories amongst all the others, I began to see how mine did not exist in isolation. Melding my stories with the others helped me to move beyond the self-isolating behaviors of my past. Here are a few of my experiences that are shared in the book. Walking with my dad was very slow. He couldn't rush even if he needed to. When I was little, I used to walk with a fake limp so I could be like him. Towards the end of his life, I grew very protective and I'd walk slowly by his side all the time. The night before my dad died, I was in his hospital room, sitting on his bed and holding his hand. I told him I loved him, but he was in and out of consciousness. His eyes were opening and closing. He was having trouble keeping his head straight on his shoulders, and he couldn't respond to me. I could tell he was trying, but the disease and the medications had taken their toll. When I walked out, I was in a daze. My mom asked me if I was scared that he was going to die. I cried in her arms. I said yes. My mom and brother woke me up at 6 a.m. and told me the news that I feared was coming. My dad died early that morning at the hospital. It took a few minutes to sink in. Then, the sensation I felt was as if someone stepped on my heart, applied pressure with a big boot, and did not let up. As my only defense, I cradled myself in my bed and cried and screamed for many hours. In the fleeting moments of actual thought, all I could do was wonder how my life could possibly continue. It felt like the end. I was in the synagogue before the service began and before the masses of people arrived. Somebody asked me if I wanted to see my dad in the coffin. I said yes because I thought I was supposed to. I touched his arm. It was a frigid and scary touch. His arm was so cold and still. He was wearing his Yankee hat and a suit, and he had a camera around his neck. He certainly looked like my dad. The image of his body in the coffin remains vivid and clear in my mind today. I can easily step back into that moment at any time, and my mind often carries me there unwillingly. The image is haunting and not at all comforting. Saying yes to seeing my dad's body in his coffin is undoubtedly the biggest regret of my life. 3 weeks after I turned 14, I wrote my eulogy for my dad's funeral. I was not able to read it in front of the large crowd of people, so I had a family friend read it for me. Dear Father, I know you are in a better place now, where no illness may harm you. I am proud of you, Father. You fought for yourself and your family as best as you could for 15 years. You are the bravest and strongest man I will ever know. I too am a fighter like you. Everything that you had in you, I now have in me. I have your strength and love in me, your intelligence and your loving heart inside of me, your will to live, your strength to never give up, and your kindness and love towards others. I have this and more, all from you, Father. And from this, I realize you are not only my role model, but my hero in life. It makes me so proud and so happy when all of your friends and family tell me how great a man you are, how great a son, how great a dad you are, and how great a husband you are, and how everyone who knows you loves you, and how you never had anything bad to say about anyone. We are all going to miss you, Father, but you will be with all of us all of the time. You will be with me and Graham to help guide us through our lives. And you will be here to guide Mom when she needs help. And you will guide your parents to live the rest of their lives to the fullest. I love you more than anyone else on this entire earth. I want to thank you for all the years of happiness, sadness, and laughter you have given us. These years will never be forgotten. I promise you that. I love you so much, Dad, your son, Zander. I've held my grief close to my chest for a long time. I spent close to 20 years in an almost constant state of processing, churning the impact of my dad's death on my life. The enormous mountain of grief that I climbed and continue to climb is what I focused on. I was isolated in my grief, but this project has caused two fundamental shifts. Firstly, I found a way to externalize my experience, which is crucial for healing. Secondly, I pivoted from focusing on how my father's death shaped me to focusing on the impact of his life. I did find part of myself in my dad's death, but I have found much more of myself in his life. Day-to-day life has become easier in the years since my dad's passing, but the pain has never gone away. I feel the sting with every milestone. My wife, Katie, and I and our families all made the conscious decision to make my dad very present at our wedding in June of 2018. He was mentioned in every speech. After we kissed and walked back down the aisle, Katie and I stepped into a private room just to be with each other for a few minutes before joining the party. As soon as we sat down, I burst into tears. I cried intensely in her arms for what felt like a very long time. I didn't need to explain to her why I was crying so hard. She knew. The happiest moments in my life are often the most painful because I can't share them with my dad. I wish he could meet Katie. I know that he would love her, and I can see them having a witty banter like old friends. I wish he could be the amazing grandfather that I know he would have been to my nephew Miles and my daughter Eleanor. I can only imagine the incredible photos he would take of his grandchildren. Katie and I had Eleanor while I was deep in the throes of writing this book. When she was born, I did not feel my dad's absence as I had expected to. Instead, more than ever before, I felt surrounded by his presence. The sting that I had felt at earlier milestones like my wedding day had actually softened. This is a direct result of the healing nature of this project. Almost all of what I've shared with you about my dad today, I learned as a result of my reaching out, asking questions, reading, and going through old family photos and documents. This project has surfaced so much information, so many realizations, and importantly, it has fostered many connections, both old and new. Illness was an important and constant part of my dad's life. His medical conditions impacted his every decision. My dad believed that he wouldn't live past the age of 30 or have children. Later, he knew that his boys and his partner would eventually lose him. I am in awe of his resilience, his perseverance, and his ability to remain a positive force in the lives of so many people while his body was under assault. But I have also come to realize that he did not have the emotional space nor language to talk about his mental health with his family or friends. I know that his parents did not encourage vulnerability. And friends that I spoke to for the book said that he avoided talking about his illness and looming death. If he did break down at times, and who wouldn't, very few people ever saw it. And that translated to his approach to parenting. My parents wanted my brother and me to live with as little stress and heartache as possible. So they told us about his HIV/AIDS status, and the conversation stopped there. My mother told me that her job was to maintain positivity in our home. That was my dad's wish. But positivity took the form of silence around my dad's illness and looming death. I empathize with the challenge they faced, but I wish that my parents had talked openly with my brother and me about what was happening in their lives and inside of our home. This would have better equipped us to cope with my dad's death, both individually and as a family.
Dad and I spent a lot of time driving to and from school, sports, band practice, etc. We often sat in silence. It felt awkward, like we both wanted to talk but weren't sure what to say. I was sitting in my room playing my bass guitar with the door closed, and out of nowhere, Dad came in and asked, "What do you think about God? Do you believe in God?" I was so taken aback that I didn't know how to answer such a big question on the spot. I said something about believing in some higher power, but not one singular being. He just shook his head in acknowledgement and walked out. We had a few interactions like that.
That was my brother speaking. I wish I had been more helpful to my mother as she cared for my dad, but I didn't know how hard it was for her. I wish I had asked my dad questions about his illnesses, but I didn't know how or what to ask. I wish we had talked more as a family about how we could have best supported each other before my dad died, so that we could do the same for each other afterwards. I wish we had sought professional help. At the end of the day, I wish more than anything that my dad had talked to us more about his illness and his death. And I wish that he understood that talking about difficult things and living a joyous, fulfilling life are not mutually exclusive. In fact, the former is often necessary to achieve the latter. There is more strength in vulnerability than there is in stoicism, but that was not displayed for me. In retrospect, I can compare my experience of his death to running a marathon without training and without warming up before the race. My body was not prepared. It went into shock, and therefore my recovery was not gentle, and it took a very long time. For the first time in my life, I have identified anger that I now understand is directed towards my dad. I am angry at his silence and his reluctance to share his emotional struggle with me. But I am also comforted by this because I no longer hold on to an idealized version of my dad. I now know him as a whole person with flaws just like anyone else. And because I know so much more about his story and my mother's, I'm able to meet them both with compassion, empathy, and understanding, even as I acknowledge my anger. My mom wrote, Randy's sensitivity, emotion, and how he looked at life can be seen and felt through his photos. I couldn't agree with this more. While my dad did not speak openly about his anger regarding his disability, the injustice of his HIV infection, or his fear of death, I sense so much feeling in his photos. In them, I see and feel my dad's longing and lust for life. His photography was his way out of the darkness. It gave him purpose and allowed him to connect to his inner self. I believe it kept him grounded until the day he died. His identity as a photographer overpowered his identity as a sick person. When he died, he did not leave behind any departing message in a letter or video. Whatever he would have said is up to us to find in his photography. Working with his photos keeps me connected to my dad, and it's the most fulfilling experience of my life. Now, I'd like to return to my creative process. I compiled every story that I received into one document, printed all 80 pages worth, and went through everything with highlighters to note the content I wanted to keep for the book. After this initial edit, I created an edited stories document, printed it all again, and cut out each individual story. My wife and I created storyboards and came up with ideas for the sequence and how to best present the content in an interesting way. We decided to piece it all together chronologically so that the arc of the book would represent the arc of my father's life. The title of the book, Unburying My Father, came to me naturally. I had literally unburied my dad's entire photo collection and subsequently the pieces of his life that I had always wanted to know about. Then my own buried story emerged. What began as an idea to simply share my father's photography with the world became an exploration of my own experience of loss. I recently read a book by Khaled Hosseini. In it, he wrote, "It is important to know your roots, to know where you started as a person. If not, your own life seems unreal to you, like a puzzle. Like you have missed the beginning of a story and now you're in the middle of it, trying to understand." As I came to understand my parents more fully, I consequently came to understand myself, which has healed me in powerful ways. The process of communicating this experience is exactly what I needed to do in order to redeem my past, heal my present, and move forward with a more open heart. Talking about my feelings has never been easy. I'm now learning the healing power of storytelling, how finding a way to share my narrative has helped me understand and talk about my grief, and that the act of sharing my story is the best way to ease the pain of my loss. I have sat with tears streaming down my face on most days that I've worked on this book, and I now understand how badly I needed to do that. If you are grieving the loss of a loved one, I encourage you to speak to the people who loved them. Ask them all the questions you've always wanted to ask. Even though I didn't get all the answers, this experience helped me understand that I was never alone in my grief, even though it felt that way for so long. I recently listened to a podcast produced by Rachel Cusick, who spoke about her own experience of loss. She said, "I don't think I was ever able to bear witness to death when my mom died because of my age. and because people were sheltering me from having to stare at it so deeply as a kid, which I think is probably an act of compassion. But when you walk into the world and all you're left with is a silhouette of what happened to you and also to the person you love, you don't have a bridge to living in a world without them. It took me over 20 years to build my bridge, and my dad is no longer a silhouette. If you or someone in your family lives with hemophilia, that means that your life involves particular challenges, regular medical maintenance, and perhaps some barriers to doing what is meaningful to you. It also means that you are inherently resilient. You have a unique perspective, and you are part of an important and supportive community of people like my dad who have connected, organized, and advocated for better care, better quality of life for themselves and others like them. The first time I spoke to the directors of HFA, they told me that I was a member of the hemophilia community. Nobody had ever said that to me before. I want to thank you for inviting me and for hearing my story. Thank you very much.
Zander, I can't even begin to thank you enough. I know I speak for the whole audience to express our profound appreciation for you allowing us to get to know your dad and for sharing your experience of unburying your father. It has really been, I am really humbled to be here with you. And I know that in questions that I've gotten from the chat, people are very eager to speak with you about your process. And I know that we enjoyed all of this, and it has gone a little longer that is not allowed for questions. But I would like the audience to know that there is a Keynote Zander channel on our Slack environment, and Zander has graciously agreed to kind of monitor that throughout symposium and occasionally check in. And so if there are questions about Zander's process or his experience that you would like to ask, please go to the Slack environment and ask, and he will answer them as he has time to. Again, I thank you so much for being a part of this, and I guess we can probably tell people that they could look forward to seeing you at Symposium in San Antonio in 2022. And we hope to have your book published by then, correct?
I do too.
Great.
That's my goal, and I'm really, really looking forward to it. And sorry for going over time, but thank you so much for listening and for inviting me. It's been a really an honor and a pleasure.
Well, thank you so much, and welcome to the hemophilia community. Your official welcome here. I guarantee you will have a bigger welcome in San Antonio when everyone gets to meet you. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. And again, everyone, if you would like to ask Zander further questions, you may go to the Keynote Zander Slack channel in our Slack environment. So thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here. And I encourage you to go back to the agenda to find the links for the other sessions that will begin at the top of the hour and then at the 7 o'clock hour. So thank you. Take care, Zander.
Thanks, you too.